Jack was a 25-year-old philosophy student. Philosophy wasn't always the thing, far from it, actually. It wasn't even a first choice. He had big aspirations. He wanted to be either a tech genius or an influential entrepreneur. But fate had a different course set for him. His grandfather was a very rich old man, with a warped sense of humor. His will stipulated a strange condition: if Jack wanted to inherit his money, he had to graduate with a degree in philosophy. So, he got into being a philosophy student, and he went out to read Plato, Nietzsche, and Kant, although, for his part, he found these people as dry as dust. Years ticked by in those classrooms, where his peers spoke in riddles, debating the very essence of existence and what it meant to exist. He would often stare at the blackboard blankly, wrestling with why he was there at all. All his intense studying eluded enlightenment, and he found no deeper purpose. He felt stuck, trapped in a monotonous life. The promise of wealth didn't excite him anymore. It was like a distant mirage. He wanted something more: excitement, adventure, or at least a sense of meaning, but life had other ideas. The most thrilling part of Jack's day was choosing which coffee shop to visit. Day after day, he caught himself entangled in a monotonous routine, somehow feeling that he was being slowly strangled by the heavy drudgery of his life. It was another very long, boring day with meaningless philosophical debates. Jack needed to leave this sort of life he was stuck within: lectures, empty speeches, and constant waiting for the inheritance from his grandfather. He merely felt that urge for something in that impulsive flash of decision, as something that could perhaps garnish his life a little bit, if only that night. Into the red light district of the city he went. It was a place he'd never been to, never even stepping foot in, but one he'd heard about. Silently, he wandered through streets dimly lit with neon lights that buzzed and flickered like distant stars. Around him, shady characters and alluring places where people looked to forget the drabness of daily routine or enjoy themselves. Jack felt a new kind of excitement. Indeed, it was a thrill he had never, ever experienced before. He entered a dingy and run-down brothel that hadn't been swept in over 40 years. The smell of alcohol, sweat, and cheap perfume hung heavy in the air. Jack, who was already half drunk, found himself laughing at the absurdity of it all. Here he was, a philosophy student, someone who debated the essence of life and the existence of the soul, paying for a night with a prostitute. It was almost poetic. In a twisted way, the woman with him was equally uninterested in her job. They mumbled a few of the exceedingly awkward words before he settled onto the stained mattress. Nervous, unsure of what to say or do, he attempted to ease himself, to relax into the experience, but his stomach had other plans. Jack felt churning in his stomach. Initially, he dismissed it as the beer he'd guzzled earlier. Still, the churning became sharper, cutting him up inside. Before he could even react, his body turned on him. He emitted a loud, wet fart, followed almost at once by a wave of nausea. He tried to fight it off, but it was too late. He leaned over and threw up all over the poor woman. For an instant, they were totally silent. Jack caught the combination of repulsion and shock on her face, but nothing would come out of his mouth to apologize. His vision blurred, his head whirled about him, and he felt himself slipping into unconsciousness. His body slumped, hitting the mattress. The last sound he was aware of was the woman screaming for help and another big fart. His last thoughts were, "So this is the grand meaning of life, farting into oblivion," and that was it for Jack. Not exactly a heroic death, nor a tragic one. It was the kind of death that would make one laugh, a dark punchline to a joke: his life. Alone in a dingy brothel, from what seemed to be a combination of alcohol poisoning and choking on his own vomit. It was, as he would have called it, a meaningless death, fitting for someone who had spent his life pondering the meaning of existence. Darkness enveloped Jack, pulling him into the abyss. He felt nothing, saw nothing. It was as if time had stopped. No aching, no light, no sound, just an endless emptiness. If he had been conscious, he might well have thought this the afterlife he had so fiercely debated in his classes of philosophy, a place of pure nothingness. Then something happened. He was floating in this warm thick liquid, and he could not open his eyes, not even move his limbs. He did not feel that his body belonged to him anymore. He tried to remember everything. The brothel, the vomiting, the darkness, it all came back as flashes. He should have died. He was dead. Before he could make anything of it, he heard voices. Muffled, distant voices. They were speaking, but he did not understand the words. Yet the sounds were somehow comforting, like listening to a gentle hum through a thick wall. He tried to open his eyes to see where he was, but his body felt weak and unresponsive to the control of his mind. Something in him flowed out, and he was drawn from the warm liquid. He sucked in the air as he felt his lungs fill up. He uttered a scream. It was a shriek of piercing cry. He felt small, minuscule, like he had shrunk himself to the size of an oat. It didn't make any sense. His vision remained cloudy. As his eyes adjusted, he saw faces. They were huge and towered over him. He felt a firm grip on his body, but when looking down realized he was in the hands of a woman wearing a white coat. She was smiling, tears in her eyes. Another face came into view, a man with dark hair and pure bliss written all over him. "It's a boy," the woman said with a gentle smile. "Congratulations, Mr. Stark." Everything in Jack's brain was running like a racehorse in a sprinting competition. Mr. Stark? He knew that name. But it couldn't be. He tried to comprehend what was happening, but the reality hit him like a truck. Stark. Baby. Shit. He wasn't just any baby. He was Tony Stark, the genius billionaire playboy philanthropist from the Marvel Universe. He was reborn, not as himself but as a baby version of one of the most iconic characters in fiction. Thoughts were swirling in his head in confusion, disbelief, and weird excitement. He died in a most absurd way, only to be reborn as Tony Stark. What a dream. Ha ha ha. But everything felt so real, the chill of the air, the sound of voices, the brightness of the lights. If this was a dream, it was one hell of a vivid one. He felt himself being handed over to a woman. Her face was the first clear image he saw. She was beautiful, with soft features and a loving gaze. This must be Maria Stark, Tony's mother. She held him close, smiling down at him with pure adoration. "Hello, my little heart," she whispered, her voice filled with warmth. The man beside her, Howard Stark, looked at him with pride. "He's perfect," Howard said, gently touching his tiny hand. Jack, or rather, Tony, stared up at them. He was still trying to get his head wrapped around everything that was going on. He had all of Jack's memories, his thoughts, his personality, but he was now in the body of Tony Stark, a baby at that. This was the Marvel Universe, a world full of superheroes, villains, and epic battles. He was no longer that purposeless philosophy student named Jack. He was soon to be Tony Stark, the future Iron Man. A genius billionaire playboy philanthropist? Yeah, I could get used to this. Alright, time to live a life free of regrets and full of fun. Wait, is Thanos still a thing? The mansion was silent except for the metronomic tick-tock of a grandfather clock in one corner and the gentle thrum of machines working from Howard Stark's workshop. In the big library, a little boy sat in a leather armchair with a book nearly as big as he was in his lap. He turned the page, focused solely. Jack, no, Tony, had come a long way since that surreal day when he first realized his new reality. He wasn't the type to wallow in existential crises or waste time asking why or how this happened. Instead, he accepted it with surprising ease, figuring he'd been handed a second chance and might as well make the most of it. Still, adapting wasn't easy. At first, his infant body was frustratingly weak and slow. Everything, sitting up, walking, even talking, required grueling effort. But once he mastered his tiny limbs and started speaking, things became interesting. Maria and Howard Stark were often busy, but their affection for him was genuine. Maria, in particular, doted on him, while Howard offered the kind of distracted yet proud admiration you'd expect from a genius with limited parenting skills. It was Howard's library, however, that became Tony's sanctuary. As Jack, he'd never been a prodigy, but here? Something about this new brain was different. He discovered it by accident, one lazy afternoon when he'd been aimlessly wandering the mansion. Stumbling into the library, he was struck by its sheer size. Shelves upon shelves of books lined the walls, filled with titles that screamed, high IQ only, advanced theoretical physics, mechanics of flight, quantum field theory. He didn't expect to understand any of it. Philosophy had been his thing, though not by choice, and his knowledge of science or engineering had been average at best. But curiosity led him to crack open a book, and as he read, the words made sense in a way they never had before. Concepts he vaguely remembered as impossible hurdles in school, like thermodynamics and electromagnetism, suddenly felt obvious. At first, he thought it was a fluke, but the more he read, the clearer it became. His mind was wired differently now. Ideas clicked into place with almost mechanical precision, each piece of information slotting neatly into a growing framework of understanding. By the time he reached the third chapter of Introduction to Advanced Robotics, he wasn't just reading, he was visualizing, planning, innovating. His small hands turned the page with a calmness that belied his racing thoughts. So, if I run current through a coil and suspend it in a magnetic field, right? That's how you get rotational motion, he muttered under his breath. His voice still carried the high-pitched timbre of a child, but his tone was all business. Tony? The voice startled him. He looked up to see Maria standing in the doorway, smiling softly. Yes, Mom? He asked, closing the book with a sheepish grin. She chuckled, walking over to him. Are you reading again? You spend more time in here than your father does in his workshop. She tousled his hair gently. It's fun, he said honestly. I like figuring things out. Maria crouched beside him, her eyes soft but searching. You're such a curious little boy. Just promise me one thing, Tony. What's that? Don't just sit all day reading, try to play some games or maybe do some running around in the garden, she said softly, smoothing a strand of hair from his forehead. You have all the time in the world to read. For now, just be a kid, okay? I don't want you to drown in tons of work all the time, like you dad. He nodded, but inwardly he knew he couldn't stop. Not now. Not when his mind felt like a furnace, constantly forging new ideas, new possibilities. Being just a kid wasn't an option. He had too much to learn, too much to do. Later that evening, Tony sat at the dinner table with his parents. His father was unusually animated, talking about his latest project for Stark Industries. It's a revolutionary propulsion system, Howard was saying, gesturing with his fork. If we can perfect it, it'll change aviation as we know it. Tony leaned forward, his small face scrunched in thought. What kind of propulsion? Jet? Rocket? Or something else entirely? Howard blinked, surprised. That's pretty specific for a 4-year-old. Tony shrugged. I read about it in your library. Jets use combustion to generate thrust, but rockets carry their own oxidizers, so they're better for space travel. Maria laughed lightly. Howard, you've created a monster. Howard stared at his son for a long moment before breaking into a smile. You're going to give me a run for my money, aren't you, kid? Tony smirked. Oh, you have no idea. The next day, Tony decided to put theory into practice. He snuck into the workshop while Howard was out, marveling at the array of tools and materials. Everything he needed was here: wires, soldering kits, scraps of metal. He started small. Using what he'd learned from the library, he rigged a simple circuit, then moved on to building a crude motor. By the end of the week, he had created a working model of a miniature electric car. It wasn't perfect, its movements were somewhat slow and little heavy on the back, but it worked. As he saw the little car splutter into action, Tony felt a sense of satisfaction. That was just the beginning. Howard Stark was not a man to be easily surprised, but Tony Stark, his 4-year-old son, was a rare exception. Howard had always been proud of his ability to recognize genius. He had seen it in himself, in his colleagues, and now, unmistakably, in his son. The electric car model had been the tipping point. Howard had found it on his workbench one evening, neatly assembled from scraps. It wasn't perfect, but the fact that a child had built it at all was staggering. Yet, Howard said nothing. He merely stood there, holding the tiny car, feeling a strange mix of pride and dread that he knew firsthand the cost of brilliance. His own intellect had brought him wealth, fame, and success, but it had also brought enemies, isolation, and endless pressure. Howard had long feared that his son might inherit this burden. Seeing Tony's creations only confirmed it. Howard resolved not to intervene, at least not yet. He'd keep an eye on Tony, guiding him subtly when needed, but for now, he would let his son enjoy the innocence of childhood. The following week, Tony wandered into Howard's workshop again. It was filled with half-finished projects, blueprints, and prototypes, as usual. Despite its cluttered appearance, everything had its place. Howard placed them according to their importance. It was here that Tony found it, a blackboard covered in a chalk diagram. The structure was unfamiliar yet intriguing, a lattice of concentric rings and interwoven lines that seemed to hum with potential even in its incomplete state. Next to the board, a stack of notes lay scattered across the desk, covered in Howard's precise handwriting. Tony climbed onto the chair and grabbed the notes, his small hands carefully flipping the pages. It didn't take long for him to realize what he was looking at, an early concept for what would one day be known as the arc reactor. His heart raced. The notes detailed Howard's vision for a compact, self-sustaining energy source, free of fossil fuels and capable of revolutionizing the world. But they also highlighted the flaws, instabilities in the energy output, inefficiencies in the containment field, and equations that didn't quite add up. Tony couldn't help but smile. He wasn't just reading, he was understanding. His mind worked through the equations like a knife slicing through butter, and ideas sprang to life with startling clarity. He saw where Howard had gone wrong, where the calculations needed tweaking, and even how the design could be improved. "Dad, you're good," Tony muttered to himself, "but you're overcomplicating things." He grabbed his notebook and began sketching. His small fingers moved with the precision of someone far older, drawing a revised design based on Howard's notes and his own memories from his past life. The movies and comics about Iron Man had given him enough of a blueprint to work with, and his new intellect filled in the gaps. For hours, Tony worked in silence, his head bent over his notebook. He didn't just recreate the arc reactor, he refined it. He even simplified the magnetic confinement field equations, adjusted the old energy core dimensions for better energy stability in a new palladium-based core, and even added a failsafe against possible overload. At the end of it, the notebook was full of diagrams, equations, and annotations. It was not a perfect design. He did not have access to all the materials or tools with which to build such a functioning reactor, but it was a solid foundation. Tony sat back in his chair, gazing at his creation. A satisfied shiver rolled over him. This was more than the school science fair or childish doodle, and this was real, something to change the world, and he wasn't even 5 years old yet.